Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight we're going to be discussing a number of different topics. Tonight, January 19th, 2015, we'll be discussing the Charlie Hebdo massacre, and we talked a little bit about this last week, shortly after the attacks occurred, and we went through a lot of the inconsistencies of the official story, and we went through a lot of what this points to, and I think it's pretty clear, especially by now, and even I think it was clear when we talked about it last week, that the event was indeed a false flag attack, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. We've got quite a bit of detail to go through in terms of this issue. We're also going to talk about guns and police if we have time, particularly some new gun rules that are coming out as a result of a policy change from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the BATFE, and we'll also discuss some South Carolina police issues and try to bring a few cases to light and to try to erase this idea that South Carolina is somehow more just in terms of law enforcement than any other state. Well, maybe more so than New York, but not by much. Now, for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, I should mention you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY, ucy.tv, and you can catch the on the show's webpage, which is ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. You'll find the article archives, the RSS feed of more recent articles that I've done popping up on the left-hand side of the page with the links there. You'll also find the archive versions of this show, the archive files, audio files, and you'll find the chat room available on the right-hand side of your screen there. And you can always join in the chat room at any time of day, but especially during this show, and find like-minded people to talk to if you're into that sort of thing. So, my work you can find regularly on activistpost.com, on theantimedia.org. You can also find my work on naturalblaze.com and a few other websites as well. If you're interested in my work specifically, then I encourage you to go to brandonturbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all the archive versions of this show, and all of the interviews. There's links to my books there as well. You just click on the books tab. That'll take you to the page where the books are located, where you can buy them. And, of course, there's an events page as well. So we hope to keep that updated and, as much as possible, keep everything on the page updated. Hopefully, in the near future, we will be making some changes to the website and improving the website, and even expanding. So that's what we're hoping to do. So please keep watching the website there. Keep listening to the show. Stay tuned for the updates. Now, the question of the Charlie Hebdo attack. I said before that we are looking at a false flag attack for a number of different reasons, and we'll get into those reasons shortly. Now, what you see in the alternative media recently and in previous incidents such as this, you see this knee-jerk reaction on either side. One knee-jerk reaction says if a tree falls in the forest, it's because the intelligence agencies did it and they had crisis actors pretending that the tree fell, that sort of thing. There's a knee-jerk reaction to say that it was a false flag. Then there is also the knee-jerk reaction to say that it's not. And, of course, the knee-jerk reaction to say that it's not has been more prevalent in the mainstream than the alternative. But recently, what's just so funny in this Charlie Hebdo attack is that there were a lot of people in the alternative media immediately claiming, this is not a false flag, stop claiming everything was a false flag. Well, here's the gist of looking at these types of incidents. You don't go out looking for every incident to be a false flag, but you don't ignore the ones that you find. And that is the idea of looking at history in terms of historical analysis. You don't look back at history and try to find everything, every conspiracy. You don't go out and try to uncover every conspiracy and call everything a conspiracy that you dig up. But when you find one, it is not your job to ignore it. So what you have to do in these situations is you have to look at the incident and you have to observe the facts, analyze the facts, and take into account the historical records, and then you make a determination. And that's what we've done, and we continue to be proven right ever since last week when we first covered that here on this show and in my articles that came out almost in real time. So we have this article I'm going to refer you to, 15 Signs the Charlie Hebdo Attack was a False Flag. My article is up at Activist Post and BrandonTurbeville.com. Put it out on January 14th of this year. And so we have the attack taking place, and we've got the pro-war right, the xenophobes, the real xenophobes, not people who are just opposed to immigration, because I think calling people who are opposed to immigration xenophobes is actually really pathetic propaganda. But the really xenophobic pro-war right is using this attack as an example of how they can paint all Muslims as terrorists, and how they can say that their total annihilation and implementation of a police state are the only solutions to this. So bigger Patriot Acts, more militarized cops on the streets, and punish the Muslims, take all the rights away from the Muslims, deport all the Muslims, declare war on Islam. That sort of thing is coming from the right. On the other hand, you have the left wing, which is essentially blaming the victim. They're blaming the magazines. They're blaming people who aren't of the protected minority status for inciting hatred and inciting the violence. And of course, you've got the vast majority of people in the middle who are very much apt to believe the official story and then, quake in their boots for a few minutes and then move on to whatever entertainment's provided to them by the TV, and then forget that the whole thing ever happened. Now, there's much more to the story that's being reported by these mainstream outlets, and lots of questionable details regarding this attack and the attacks that surrounded it, and all the connections that these individuals who perpetrated the attack have to one another and to other terrorist cells. So you can't just engage in knee-jerk reactions as a result of this. So we've got the Charlie Hebdo attack, and we've also got the attack on the kosher grocery store in Paris as well. And these are being ludicrously, they're being portrayed as lone wolf attacks in the mainstream media. And this was, the mainstream could call this a lone wolf attack, but by their own admission, by their own information, this is not a lone wolf attack. This is not a lone wolf situation at all. It's a coordinated situation with terrorist cells, and we'll talk about that. So what I've got in this article is essentially it's a breakdown of at least 15 points that shed some light on this situation that people should take a look at when analyzing the Charlie Hebdo massacre, and essentially this acts as documentation of the fact that this is indeed a false flag attack. So let's look at point number 1. Right, the suspects had traveled to Syria in order to fight against the secular government of Bashar al-Assad. So, and we're talking about the Charlie Hebdo massacre here. We have Sharif and Saeed Kouachi, and both of these guys were veterans of the NATO Western-backed invasion of terrorist proxies fighting against the Assad government. Right, not only we have Sharif being arrested in 2005, sentenced to 3 years in prison for attempting to join jihadists fighting in Iraq, but later he and his brother Saeed both made their way to Syria. They didn't make it to Iraq, but they made it later to Syria to fight alongside the same terrorist networks that the West has funded. Right, so essentially, Saeed and Sharif were ISIS fighters. They were Free Syrian Army fighters. They were al-Nusra fighters. It's all the same thing. Now, the Kouachi connection to terrorist networks and jihadist forces in Syria puts the likelihood that their acts are entirely controlled by the United States, the UK, France, NATO, essentially, at much higher odds, due to the fact that these terrorist networks are entirely controlled by Western intelligence agencies to begin with. So they have proven themselves to be under the command of NATO intelligence simply by being ISIS fighters in Syria. But let's look at point number 2. France itself is responsible for arming, training, and directing the very terrorist organizations fighting against the secular government of Bashar al-Assad. Now, if the attackers were really members of one of these, myriad of numbers of terrorist groups that are now documented to be under the direction and the control of Western powers, then France itself is going to be implicated in the cause of the attacks, the execution of the attacks, the implementation of the attacks. So France has been operating, let's not forget, as part of the NATO-led coalition against Assad. France has been arming al-Qaeda terrorists. They have been funding al-Qaeda terrorists. They have been aiding and perpetuating al-Qaeda terrorists for years. This is on record. They were one of the nations that were leading the charge against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and they continue to do that today in Syria. So we have this attack in Paris. This is likely the work of the terrorists that France has been arming and backing across North Africa and the Middle East. The French government then is responsible for the attacks. Now this is not just theoretical. These terrorist organizations are absolutely under the control of Western powers. Remember, we early on in the Syrian crisis, we had the capture of a number of French special forces officers by the Syrian government. The Syrian government gave them back to France. We also have the open admissions that France is arming the terrorists fighting inside Syria, that France is providing weapons to the terrorists fighting in Syria, that France is providing intelligence and direction and other forms of aid. They are arming, funding, training, aiding, perpetuating al-Qaeda. And these guys are al-Qaeda. Sharif, Saeed, they can come up with pretty little names or silly little names for their terrorist organizations, but they're al-Qaeda, and we'll see that as we move further. Now, we had a good article that came out by Tony Cartolucci of Land Destroyer Report, and his article was Timeline, Where'd Parachuters Get Their Weapons? And he provides a timeline that goes back since 2011 that documents some of the assistance that France had given to the terrorists. And I'm going to read some of this timeline to you so you can get an idea of the involvement. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, of course, but you can get an idea of the involvement that France has had with these terrorist networks. So it's 2011, France supplying weapons to Libyan rebels. This comes from the London Telegraph. And I'll read this. A French military spokesman, Colonel Thierry Boucard, said it has provided light arms such as assault rifles for civilian communities to protect themselves against Colonel Gaddafi. But the decision to arm the rebels is a further move towards direct involvement in the land war on top of the air war against Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. The Nafouza rebels have come closest to breaking through to Tripoli itself of any of the front lines of the conflict, while 3 months of NATO bombing have failed to dislodge Colonel Gaddafi from power. Le Figaro, the French newspaper which first reported the airdrop, said the shipment included rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades, along with Milan anti-tank missiles. All right, again, an article in 2011 entitled, Libyan rebel commander admits his fighters have al-Qaeda links. This comes from the London Telegraph. Abdel Hakim al-Hasidi, the Libyan rebel leader, has said that jihadists who fought against Allied troops in Iraq are on the front lines of the battle against Muammar Gaddafi's regime. Then we can move to 2012. We have an article entitled France to Push for Arming Syria's Opposition Coalition from the BBC. And it says, France's foreign minister has said he will discuss supplying arms to the Syrian opposition coalition with European partners. The government plans to push for a relaxation of the EU arms embargo to Syria to enable defensive arms to reach opposition fighters. So we go on to 2013. We have an article, Syria Crisis. France and Britain move a step closer to arming rebels. This is the London Guardian again. It says, France and Britain have moved a step closer to arming the opposition to the Assad regime in a radical move aimed at tipping the balance in the 2-year civil war while also ignoring European policy on Syria. The French President François Hollande went into an EU summit in Brussels with a dramatic appeal for Europe to join Paris and London in lifting a European arms embargo, but the sudden policy shift was certain to run into stiff German opposition. Another article, Syrian rebels pledge loyalty to al-Qaeda. This is 2013 in USA Today. Syrian rebel group's April pledge of allegiance to al-Qaeda's replacement for Osama bin Laden suggests that the terrorist group's influence is not waning and that it may take a greater role in the Western-backed fight to topple Syrian President Bashar Assad. The pledge of allegiance by Syrian Jabhat al-Nusra Front Chief Abu Muhammad al-Julani to al-Qaeda leader Sheikh Ayman al-Zawahiri was coupled with an announcement by the al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq, that it would work with al-Nusra as well. And then, of course, we've got an article coming out of France 24 in 2014 entitled, France Delivered Arms to Syrian Rebels, Hollande Confirms. President François Hollande said on Thursday that France had delivered weapons to rebels battling the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad a few months ago. So, that's just a smattering of articles that have come out of the mainstream press in Europe and the United States that demonstrate that France indeed has not only supported al-Qaeda terrorists in Libya, but they've done so in Syria. In other words, France has supported al-Qaeda, and that should not surprise the listeners of this show. Now we've got to move on to point number 3. Both suspects had been on the radar screen of French intelligence for a number of years. Their terrorist ties did not come as a surprise. All right, you're going to have to kind of bear with me here because this is where it gets sort of convoluted and complicated. Now, Sharif Kouachi, one of the brothers that were allegedly responsible for the Hebdo massacre, he was arrested in 2005. He was charged and convicted of association with wrongdoers with the intention of committing a terrorist act. And his sentence was suspended. So again, he was arrested in January of 2005, accused of planning to join jihadists in Iraq. He had fallen under the sway of this Farid bin Yato, who is a younger guy himself, a self-taught preacher who he was advocating violence, but allegedly himself had not yet traveled to Iraq or committed any terrorist acts. The lawyers at the time said he had not received weapons training and had begun, and this is Sharif, had not begun receiving weapons training at the time, had begun having second thoughts, even said he expressed relief that he'd been apprehended. In 2010, Kouachi was arrested again and charged in an attempt to help break out the terrorist, the Algerian terrorist, and a guy who was convicted of bombing a Paris rail commuter train, Smain Ait Ali Belkacem. They were trying to break him out of jail. The plot failed, but Kouachi was caught, and the charges were eventually dropped. So that's 2 arrests and prosecutions for terrorism or terrorist acts. Now we have reports, and there's reports coming out of Slate magazine. There's reports coming out of CNN. CNN did yeoman service in documenting the inconsistency of the official story by accident, of course. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So CNN says that Sharif had a long history of jihad and anti-Semitism. And he says it says that his terrorist aspirations were well known for some time prior to the Hebdo attacks. Now, CNN basically reports that there's a 400-page court record from 2007 where Kouachi was described as wanting to travel to Iraq to go and combat the Americans. And this is what Kouachi says in that deposition. He says, "I was ready to go and die in battle, and I got this idea when I saw the injustices shown by television on what was going on over there. I'm speaking about the torture that the Americans have inflicted on the Iraqis." All right, end quote. Now, Saeed Kouachi, well, let's just wait a minute. We'll come back to Saeed. We'll stick with Sharif for a minute for chronology's sake. Sharif Kouachi was raised in orphanages and foster homes from a very young age, became involved in this group in Paris called the 19th arrondissement, or that's district, according to the court papers anyway. That's what it means, 19th district in Paris. It's named for that neighborhood. So the prosecutors in these cases outlined a number of strong details of Kouachi's interest in jihad and his interest in martyrdom and his links to anti-Semitism. And keep in mind, in France, anti-Semitism can simply be, looking at a Jew cross-eyed, and that's anti-Semitism worthy of prosecution. But in this case, it's probably, the anti-Semitism is probably actually real, and by virtue of the fundamentalist nature of this guy and what he was discussing. So these documents were apparently obtained by CNN and L'Express, the French news magazine. But again, the 19th arrondissement network, that was named for the neighborhood that it was based out of, and it was apparently involved in recruiting French Muslims to fight for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq, of course, is al-Nusra. Remember that. Al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda in Iraq were essentially the same organization. They weren't essentially the same organization. They were the same organization, which became ISIS. So this guy's essentially wanting to go fight for ISIS. So we have that. So this is pretty typical in these Western-backed terrorist operations. The group preyed on poor, disenchanted, disenfranchised, struggling, working-class young Muslims. They would recruit these guys, they would get the manpower, and then they would organize for weapons training and travel arrangements to get them to the Middle East. Now, he was convicted in 2008. Sharif Kouachi was convicted in 2008. He had been arrested in 2005, just days before he had planned to go to Syria. Now, Sharif does fit the profile of a target for terrorist recruits, right? He was Muslim. He quit school. He was working a dead-end job as a pizza delivery man. He was decidedly lower working class. He was largely disenfranchised. You see, he had personal tragedy in his own life if he was raised in orphanages from a young age. So the narrative that we're being provided with, though, is that this gullible young man was then fallen under the spell of this charismatic street preacher known as Farid bin Yato, who trolled the east side of Paris for recruits. It's implied that bin Yato, who was also convicted on terrorist charges, that he played a role in setting up Sharif with the terrorist organization he had eventually joined, the 19th arrondissement, and his subsequent travels to Syria to slaughter innocent people for the benefit of the United States, France, and NATO. Probably not known to him. Now, bin Yato was responsible for recruitment. I guess it's important to point out that bin Yato was never slated to travel to Iraq. Out of the membership of that entire network, bin Yato was the only person who did not intend to fight in Iraq or Syria. He was only there as a recruitment. So I wonder, I would ask Mr. bin Yato if he has any connections to any type of NATO-based intelligence organization, or if his own handler is the individual with the NATO intelligence connections. So we'll move on from bin Yato. In 2005, it was revealed that a number of these members of the 19th Arrondissement network had affiliations with the Adawa Mosque. This is the largest mosque in Paris. Remember the connections that we had to the Finsbury Mosque in England and the other mosques in London. That's why they called it Londonistan, right? These large mosques had connections to terrorist cells, including a number of terrorists who went on to commit very high-profile terrorist attacks across the world. And, of course, 9/11 was one of them. We had the Fort Hood shooting, the underwear bomber, and a number of other individuals had connections to the Finsbury Mosque and other London mosques, high-profile mosques. Could this be the same situation that we're having in Paris, where the Adawa Mosque, which is allegedly known for being sort of a bridge between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, but in reality there are some very questionable connections about the individuals who run this mosque, so it should be looked at. But we're not going to get off topic, really. The CNN reports suggest that much of the training that Sharif and Saeed got from Benyato involved the study of how to use Kalashnikovs. So this is what Kouachi is stating as quoted by CNN. It says, the wise leader in Islam told him and his friends that if they die as martyrs in jihad, they would go to heaven, and that martyrs would be greeted by more than 60 virgins in a big palace in heaven. And that was in the documents in a section entitled Motivations of Influence. The documents also said, for him, any place on earth where there is such an injustice is justification for jihad. What was going on in Iraq was in his eyes such an injustice. All right, so this was this information we have, bear this in mind, is a matter of law enforcement and court record. These are court documents. They've been arrested twice, prosecuted twice, convicted once of terrorist acts. Now, Kouachi's behavior mirrors Muhammad Atta in a way. Certainly not a mirror image, but it resembles the behavior of Muhammad Atta because it didn't match up with the notion of a Muslim fundamentalist. So we've got these court records. It says Kouachi said he didn't consider himself a good enough Muslim. He only been to the mosque 2 or 3 times before he met Benyato, and that he smoked pot. Kouachi told investigators that he had committed himself to the idea of jihad during Ramadan in 2004. And he told his friends he was going to Syria to fight. The documents say that when the police interviewed his accomplices, they stated that Kouachi, quote, said he was ready to firebomb and destroy Jewish shops in Paris, end quote. And that's interesting, Jewish shops, because we had that at the same time. We have the kosher grocery store being held up. When officials confronted Kouachi with that information, he told them, that's not exactly what I said. I don't hide having proposed anti-Semitic ideas, but I would note that I never really would have done that. All right, so Kouachi says, yeah, basically, I don't like Jews, but I wouldn't have done any of that. That's interesting. It's also interesting that he's a pot smoker, and that he expressed relief at being caught the first time. Now, Kouachi's lawyer, this is Vincent Olivier, painted a very different picture of his client in the 2005 incident. He says the attorney said his client's profile was, quote, a pot smoker from the projects, more so than an Islamist. And he told a French newspaper, Libération, I believe, the morning after Sharif's arrest, he says he smokes, he drinks, doesn't sport a beard, and has a girlfriend before marriage. Doesn't fit the profile of a jihadist, right? So according to the TV network, France 3, which first aired in 2005, the report aired in 2005, described Kouachi as a young fan of rap, more interested in chasing girls than going to the mosque. And, of course, the report then says all of these interests changed immediately when he met Benyato. Interesting. That fairly normal guy, and all of a sudden, his behavior changes when he meets this radical street preacher. Now, there are reasons for that, and we're not going to go into all the detailed intricacies of how these terrorists are created, how patsies are created, and what the networks look like necessarily. We'll save that for a future show. I've gone through a lot of that on previous shows, but we're going to stick with the Hebdo details right now. That's Sharif. Let's talk about Saeed Kouachi, right? This is his connections to terrorism and terrorist cells and other terrorist cases. Saeed, his name is repeatedly appearing on the outskirts of terrorism trials in France, but he was never a focal point of the investigations until this time. So we get this information here from CNN, and this is that a French official told CNN that Saeed received training in Yemen. He didn't give any details about when that trip occurred or how long it lasted, but we also had CNN reporting that a U.S. official saying that the United States was giving information from the French intelligence agencies. They were getting information from French intelligence agencies that Saeed Kouachi traveled to Yemen as late as 2011 on behalf of the Al-Qaeda affiliates there. Now, his time in Yemen is corroborated by a Yemeni journalist who says that he saw Saeed there. And he says that Saeed claimed to have briefly been a roommate of Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib. Does anybody remember that name? That is the underwear bomber, right? This is the guy who tried to blow up the plane with a bomb in his underwear, and now it results in you having sexual experiences every time you go to the airport. That's why you get sexually assaulted. Well, it's not why, but that was the justification, despite the fact that they ordered the body scanners a year ahead of time. Just convenient, again, coincidence theory, I guess. But Muttalib, if you've ever been raped at the airport by the disgusting employees at the TSA, then you will know that, then you should know the name Muttalib. That should be burned into your brain. Alright, so we've got Muttalib, the convicted underwear bomber, or would-be underwear bomber, I guess we should say. That happened in 2009 over Detroit. We've got the Yemeni journalist and researcher Mohammed Al-Kibsi. He told CNN that he saw Saeed Kouachi twice in the old city of Sana'a in Yemen in 2011 and 2012. Al-Kibsi said he was researching Abdul Muttalib's background in January 2011 when he came across Kouachi, and it was unintentional. He said that Kouachi was friendly and he used to walk around the old city, and that's how he met Al-Kibsi. Kouachi said that he and Abdul Muttalib used to pray together at Yemen's Al-Tabari school, and that they shared an apartment for 1 to 2 weeks in Yemen. Kouachi was studying Arabic grammar at the Sana'a Arabic Grammar Institute, according to Al-Kibsi. And so Al-Kibsi said he saw Kouachi again in 2012 in the old city of Sana'a and another Arabic language center. CNN, they, of course, reported that they don't have official confirmation that Saeed and Abdul Muttalib knew each other. But so, of course, we know that news reports do need CNN's corroboration, because if they don't have CNN's corroboration, they're not true. I say that with sarcasm for those of you who are sarcastically impaired. The reports, there's a Nigerian national, or CNN doesn't have the confirmation. This is coming from the CNN report. I'm going to read this part here. CNN does not have official confirmation that Saeed Kouachi knew Abdul Muttalib, a Nigerian national who, authorities said at his U.S. trial, told the FBI that he had links to Yemen-based Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Last month, AQAP released a video apparently showing Abdul Muttalib with the group's leader, Nasser al-Wuhayashi. All right. The U.S. official who said Saeed Kouachi had traveled to Yemen said the man had received a variety of weapons training from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. It's also possible Saeed Kouachi was trained in bomb making, a common jihadist training in Yemen. So that's CNN. Now, in addition to Saeed's travel to Yemen, it's also known that at least one of the brothers, and we're not exactly clear which one of the brothers it was had traveled to Syria for the purpose, of acting as NATO's proxy army against Assad. And again, it's not exactly clear which brother went to Syria, or if just one of them went. It's open. It could have been both. But we have a USA Today report that both brothers had returned from Syria this summer. CNN was somewhat more vague. It cites a French intelligence source as putting at least one of the brothers in Syria earlier this year. But I think it's pretty clear that at least one of them was in Syria. The odds are pretty good that both were as well. So, with all of this information available to the American government and intelligence apparatus and the French government and intelligence apparatus, it's pretty clear that Sharif and Saeed's terrorists' tendencies and connections and history and risks of committing a terrorist attack inside France were well known. But we are expected to believe that one of these suspects was arrested on terrorism charges not once, but twice. Both suspects repeatedly expressed interest in and desire for jihad. One traveled to Yemen for training, roomed with a known terrorist who committed one of the most publicized terrorist attacks in recent years, and met with one of the most notorious terrorist leaders of recent years. There's Anwar al-Awlaki. We'll get to that in a minute. And at least one of them, maybe even both, had traveled to Syria to fight with ISIS, all the while being monitored by French and U.S. intelligence. Yet the Charlie Hebdo attacks were somehow unforeseen. Come on, people. This is beyond belief. Indeed, beyond belief. Now, if Kouachi had been, could have been arrested in 2005 for association with wrongdoers with the intention of committing a terrorist act, then why couldn't he be arrested for the same thing in 2015? Why could he not have been arrested for doing the same thing abroad in Syria? Why were they not arrested immediately upon returning to France from either Syria or Yemen for receiving training from a terrorist organization, for committing terrorist acts, or for even associating with these terrorist organizations? Why weren't they arrested? Why weren't they stopped? Well, let's move on here. We've got more information. A good article was written by Tony Cartolucci. I don't have the title. I think it was Parachuting Suspects Under French Radar for Years. That's Land Destroyer Report. I would send you to that article as well if you want to get Cartolucci's take. But the American and French intelligence apparatus was well aware of the Kouachi brothers and the Charlie Hebdo attackers and what was going on with them. We have this article now coming from the Wall Street Journal entitled "Overburdened French Dropped Surveillance of Brothers." Overburdened. It's funny. If they're overburdened, then perhaps they should stop listening in to every single American citizen's telephone calls and just focus on the ones that give you the idea that they might be involved in terrorist acts. Or is it possibly that they're more interested in surveilling the average American and the average French person than they are the terrorist agencies that they employ? After all, there's really no need to monitor the terrorist actors in real time, since they're employed by the intelligence agencies to begin with. They know what they're going to do. They're telling them to do it. So I guess it's a bit redundant. Of course, the truth of the matter, again, is that these terrorists are funded by the intelligence operations, and the average American, the average Frenchman, are the real threat that's seen by the French government and the American government. It's not the terrorists. The terrorists are in the employment of these intelligence apparati. But we'll get to that at some other point, some other show. The article, Wall Street Journal, overburdened French drop surveillance of brothers. And this is what they claim. Now, I'll read from the article. The terrorist attacks in Paris that have killed 17 people over 3 days this week represent one of the worst fears and failures of counter-terrorist officials. A successful plot coordinated by people who had once been under surveillance but who were later dropped is a top priority. This is a competence theory. The U.S. provided France with intelligence showing that the gunmen in the Charlie Hebdo massacre received training in Yemen in 2011, prompting French authorities to begin monitoring the two brothers, according to U.S. officials. But that surveillance of Saeed and Sharif Kouachi came to an end last spring, U.S. officials said, after several years of monitoring turned up nothing suspicious. France reportedly has over 1,000 citizens under surveillance who have recently traveled to Iraq and Syria, believed to have fought alongside terrorists France itself has been arming. An NBC article titled French Intelligence is Tracking 1,000 who have been to Iraq. Syria expert, it is reported that, actually this, I apologize, my notes have been a bit messed up here. So, the quote here is coming from Tony Carlucci. France reportedly has over 1,000 citizens under surveillance who have recently traveled to Iraq and Syria, believed to have fought alongside terrorists France itself has been arming. And then he goes and quotes an NBC article entitled French Intelligence is Tracking 1,000 who have been to Iraq, Syria, expert. It is reported that French intelligence is mostly focused today on more than 1,000 French citizens that traveled to Syria and Iraq since 2012, said Jean-Charles Brissard, the author of Zarqawi, the new face of al-Qaeda. He added that 1/5 of them were being tracked around the clock. This is a problem of resources, he added. We cannot follow everyone. All right, so we can look further in that article. It's got Brissard saying that the brothers had been well known to French intelligence for several years. And it's also known that the suspects were not only being tracked by French and U.S. intelligence, but they were selected essentially as prime candidates for pulling off these attacks. France is still occupying many of its former colonies in Africa, and it had participated in the destruction of Libya, and it is now working against Assad in Syria. So we can see the way this stuff stacks up. We also have a report from France 24 last year in an article titled France Delivered Arms to Syrian Rebels. Hollande says that here let's quote from that article as well. President Francois Hollande said on Thursday that France had delivered weapons to rebels battling the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad a few months ago, and of course that is coming from France 24. Now, it's likely that if the Paris shooters were indeed in Syria, they have been probably holding French-supplied weapons and probably been involved in French-funded or French-assisted weapons training there as well. They've certainly been fighting on the side of France for however long they've been in Syria. So let's move on to point 4 here. I hope we can get to all of these throughout the show in the time that we have left. So we have Kouachi's ties to Anwar al-Awlaki. Now, we have an interview that was published in the UK Mirror entitled Paris Shootings, Listen to Terrorist Amadi Koulibaly's Bizarre Conversation with Hostage During Supermarket Siege. This article, this interview, quoted Kouachi as telling journalists that, quote, "We are just telling you that we are defenders of the Prophet and that I, Sharif Kouachi, have been sent by al-Qaeda of Yemen and that I went over there and that Anwar al-Awlaki financed me," end quote. So we have Saeed Kouachi's trip to Yemen that has been largely documented by claims coming from both the U.S. and French intelligence agencies. We also have CNN reporting, quoting U.S. intelligence agency sources. This is a quote. "The United States is now working on the assumption that Charlie Hebdo attacker Saeed Kouachi met an American terrorist cleric Anwar al-Awlaki at some point in Yemen and that received orders from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to carry out an attack," a U.S. official tells CNN. All right, end quote. Anwar al-Awlaki, if anybody doesn't know that name, I don't know where you've been, but Anwar al-Awlaki is known to have links to a number of high-profile terrorist attacks in the past. Nadal Malik Hassan of the Fort Hood shootings was in contact with al-Awlaki. Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab, the underwear bomber, had contacts with al-Awlaki. Nawaf al-Hazmi, Khalid al-Midar, and Hani Hanjour, that's the 9/11 attackers. And a number of other terrorists had connections to Anwar al-Awlaki. In fact, al-Awlaki's connections to such a high number of high-profile terrorist attacks, as well as his own connections to the U.S. intelligence agencies, is what led Webster Tarpley to label him, this is a quote too, an obvious U.S. double agent who has been used to give the al-Qaeda seal of approval to dozens of terrorists, end quote. This is what Tarpley labeled him, as Anwar al-Awlaki, the CIA lackey. So we've also got a report. I'll read the report. It comes from CBS News. Qaeda-linked imam dined at Pentagon after 9/11. This is interesting as well. I just want to throw this out there. This is from the article. Anwar al-Awlaki, the radical spiritual leader, linked several 9/11 attackers, the Fort Hood shooting, and the attempted Christmas Day bombing of an airliner, was a guest at the Pentagon in the months after 9/11, a Pentagon official confirmed to CBS News. And al-Awlaki was invited as part of an informal outreach program in which officials sought contact with leading members of the Muslim community, the official said. At the time, al-Awlaki was widely viewed as a moderate imam at a mosque in Northern Virginia. In the mosque at Northern Virginia. You know what else is in Northern Virginia? Langley. At the same time, the FBI was also interviewing al-Awlaki about his contacts with three of the 9/11 attackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi, Khalid al-Midar, and Hani Hanjour, who were all part of the crew of 5 that attacked the American Airlines jet that hit the Pentagon. All right, so the connections to Anwar al-Awlaki, and I mentioned this earlier. The number 5 was Karachi lived with Abdul Muttalab, the underwear bomber. We won't go over this again. We've already done that in the article that I mentioned in the previous minutes. Number 6, though, the Charlie Hebdo attackers were apparently part of an organized network. Now, we have an article, this is pretty detailed, by Henry Samuel and Patrick Sauer for the Telegraph. And it's titled, Charlie Hebdo Attack, the Karachi Brothers and the Network of French Islamists with Links to Islamic State. And they say that the Kawachis had ties to a number of other known terrorists who themselves belong to organizations funded and directed by Western intelligence. Right? For instance, we have Samuel and Sauer noting that during the 2005 prison stay of Sharif, Sharif came to meet Dajamel Begal, also known as Abu Hamza, as a terrorist who was serving a 10-year prison sentence for a plot to blow up the U.S. Embassy in 2001. Hamza maintained links to the Finsbury Mosque in London. Remember that? I mentioned that earlier. It's a notorious intelligence operation used to create, recruit, and maintain Islamic terrorists. Now, Begal was serving a 10-year sentence for plotting to blow up the U.S. Embassy in Paris in 2001. He also had links to the Finsbury Mosque. And we also have reports here that French intelligence agencies, or French intelligence agents, photographed Sharif playing football with Begal in Murat in the Cantal region of central France, where he was on house arrest in 2010. There were 2 other Islamists present, Ahmed Ladouni and Farik Malouk. So we've got links to from Sharif Karachi to Salim Bengalim, that is a Frenchman of Algerian descent who was one of America's most wanted international terrorists, allegedly. We had Bengalim met and befriended Sharif's friend Buchnak while the two shared a cell in 2008 in Fresnay prison following his conviction for attempted murder. And after he was released, Bengalim extended the influence to other members of the Boutte Chaumont network, and that is coming from Le Monde, coming from intelligence sources cited by Le Monde. Now, he was part of a group, not Sharif, but not Bengalim, but Sharif, a group of Islamists who were trying to break Smain Ait Ali Belkacem out of prison. who was sentenced himself to life imprisonment for bombing a rail station in 2002. Well, he bombed it in 1995, was convicted in 2002, killed, injured 30 people. Sharif was convicted. He was prosecuted, but he was not actually imprisoned. So you gotta wonder why he was not in prison. So that's another question. He was convicted once, got out relatively soon, and then he was tried again, and the charges were dropped. So what is this situation? Why were the charges dropped? So we have the name of Saeed Kouachi cropping up on the sidelines of an investigation, but charges against both brothers were dropped due to lack of evidence. Of course, lack of evidence. So evidence seems to be pretty plentiful. We also have Sharif linked to Boubacar al-Hakim, known as Abu Muqatel. Hakim was a French Islamist from Tunisia, born in 1983, grew up in the 19th arrondissement, 19th district. He became a key figure in the Bouté Chamont jihadi network, and that's where he met Kouachi. Hakim is supposedly deeply implicated in the recruitment and logistical organization of French jihadists who were going off to fight in Iraq. He traveled to Iraq himself in 2002 and returned up to 4 times. And according to Jean-Pierre Fellou, that's an expert at Sciences Po University in Paris, he says that Hakim recruited militants to fight in Fallujah, which was, of course, the Iraqi city that put up so much resistance for a time. It was known as an al-Qaeda stronghold in 2004. In 2008, Hakim and Sharif were arrested and convicted in Paris for their role in the network. Hakim was sentenced to 7 years for running a way station in Damascus for young French Muslims en route to fight U.S. forces in Iraq. So this whole situation, again, as you can see, was being built up back in 2008. Fellou says that, quote, Hakim and no doubt Kouachi rejoined al-Qaeda's Iraqi networks after they were released from prison and accompanied them in their transformation into Daesh. That is the Arabic name for ISIL. The combat experience they acquired was useful in the cold-blooded assassinations they have carried out since, end quote. So, they're claiming that Hakim's 2008 arrest and imprisonment was thought to break up the Bouté Chamont network, but that's not the case. In 2013, he appeared in Tunisia, where he murdered 2 of the country's left-wing opposition politicians, Chokri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi, on February 6th, July 25th, 2013. Hakim claimed responsibility for the murders in a video on behalf of ISIL, released around that time, last month actually. And he says, we will return and kill several of you. You won't live in peace until Tunisia applies Islamic law. Fellou says that Hakim represents the link between Kouachi brothers and ISIL. He says it's impossible that an operation on the scale of the one that led to the massacre at Charlie Hebdo was not sponsored by Daesh. Well, it's possible, Fellou. It's possible that it wasn't sponsored by Daesh because Daesh itself is sponsored by CIA, by DGSE, by MI6, by NATO. So that's who sponsored the attacks. So we go into the history of Ahmedi Coulibaly, and we're running out of time, and I thought we'd be able to do at least the whole Charlie Hebdo thing before we got there, but we've got a couple minutes, so we'll get into Coulibaly, right? This is the guy that held up the kosher grocery store, killed a policewoman and 3 other people. Now, he purportedly told a CNN affiliate, BFM TV, that he belonged to ISIS, and that the CNN, again, has not independently confirmed the authenticity of the French broadcaster's recording with Coulibaly. Well, I really don't care, because this is the same organization that, when it did confirm that Syria Danny was being shot at, you see what that turned out to be. Operation Mockingbird at work, CNN. But Coulibaly was 32, interesting number, close associate of Sharif Kouachi, and a Western intelligence source tells CNN that he was a close associate of Sharif Kouachi. Coulibaly went by the alias Doli Grigny, that's according to the source, and that Coulibaly and Sharif were both involved in the 2010 attempt to free an Algerian serving time for the 1995 subway bombing. That's Belkacem that I mentioned earlier. Coulibaly was arrested in 2010 with 240 rounds of ammunition for a Kalashnikov. Good thing they have gun laws in France. He had a photo of himself with the Jamal Begal. That's the French Algerian that I mentioned earlier. He was a European recruiter for Al-Qaeda and wanted to attack the U.S. Embassy in Paris. Coulibaly was indicted in 2010, May 22nd, in connection with the prison break plot. Sharif was under investigation, but of course, as I mentioned, the charges were dropped. They called this prison break plot the Belkacem Project, which is interesting terminology in the way that it's established here and used here. Coulibaly shared residence with Boumediene. That's the woman, the wife of Coulibaly, or the girlfriend, common-law wife, I guess. They traveled to Malaysia together. All of these known terrorist attempts and connections to terrorists and other terrorist organizations. None of the individuals who were arrested and convicted, apparently, could secure a prison sentence longer than some drug offenses carry here in the police state of the United States. The United Police States. So, the common-law wife of Coulibaly, Haya Boumediene, she's still suspected of having some connection to the kosher grocery store attack, but was apparently not involved in the actual attack itself. Apparently, she took part at most in the planning stages, because I have reports coming out of mainstream outlets, Design and Trend, for instance. Reuters reports that Turkey's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mevlut Cavusoglu, told the state-run Anadolu agency that Hayat Boumediene flew into Turkey from Madrid on January 2nd, stayed at a hotel in Istanbul. There's footage of her at the airport, they say. She stayed at a hotel with another person, crossed into Syria on January the 8th, and they have telephone records to back that up, so they claim. Once the attack on the magazine took place, she apparently made her way into Syria through Turkey without a struggle, they say. ABC News reported that, well, it's easy to do that without a struggle when you're being escorted by the intelligence agencies. ABC News reported that the Turkish media published 2 videos of Hayat Boumediene going through security at a Turkish airport on January 8th, a day after the attack in the Paris publication. So, with all of this taken together, we can see that what we have here is a terrorist cell. These individuals, their connections, one way or another, they point in the opposite direction of the lone wolf theory, right? The only question left is who is ultimately in command of this cell. And you follow these tangled strands of connections back to the center of the web, you will not find the spirit of Osama bin Laden hiding in a cave in Afghanistan, but what you'll find is the Anglo-American, Anglo-European, Western intelligence network that created Islamic extremist movements to begin with, and that continue to use them for their own goals today. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. Maybe we'll pick up the rest of this next week and finish it off, but there'll be other issues that crop up, I imagine. Stay with us. We'll be back next week. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
The Anti-Media Radio with your host Nick Burnby here on UCY.tv.
Truth on the Tracks you can catch every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv.
For more news,